Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this video lesson. This is part 2 of the French Revolution. This is part 2 of 4. I am Miss Jennifer Blank. I will be your guide on this journey. So today we're going to be talking about the background to the French Revolution in great detail. Now, what you need to understand is there are both long-range, so long-term causes, and also immediate catalytic events. All right, long-range and immediate problems that help to cause this revolution. So let's start out with big picture stuff. So wealth was disproportionately spread in society. This is not an argument for socialism per se, but when you have either a top-heavy or a bottom-heavy society, and you don't have a middle class that's grounding the economic infrastructure, you're going to have problems within society. You're going to have people feeling disenfranchised, disadvantaged, and this is going to breed resentment and eventually revolution if it goes far enough. This idea of privilege, the inequality of rights, the idea that one is born into privilege and that there's no mechanism for social mobility. This was a significant problem. And that there were legal distinctions between classes, that there were legal rights and benefits conferred upon to the top, the uppermost classes, i.e. the clergy, the nobility, and that the peasant class was not reaping the benefits of these. We'll talk more about how the bourgeoisie effectively used the poorer classes to achieve their revolution and then promptly sold them out, but we'll get to that later. France experienced 50 years of France experienced 50 years of economic growth and prosperity. All right, you have an expansion of foreign trade, you have an increase in industrial production. So even though one could argue that the economics were a primary reason, it wasn't that the economy wasn't growing. Okay, that wasn't the problem. You also have the social structure of the old regime that was a significant cause of the French Revolution. You have the first and second and third estates. The estate system was not an effective method of governing. All right, so let's talk about each estate, right? So first estate is the clergy. About 130,000 people, roughly, they controlled all 10% of all land in France. So that's significant. They were exempt from the taille. That was the major tax in France because they were clergy. The church paid a voluntary contribution every 5 years, which you can guess wasn't that much because why? If you don't have to pay, why would you, right? The clergy was also divided. There was a higher clergy and the lower clergy. Higher clergy that came from aristocratic families, and they shared the interests of the nobility. The lower clergy were parish priests, and they shared the interests of the third estate or the poor commoners. All right, so the second estate is the nobility. They were about 350,000 people, and they owned 25 to 30% of all the land in France. All right, so that's a significant amount, okay? They had most leading positions in government, military, law courts, and the church officials. Under Louis the 15th and Louis the 16th, the nobility held a great deal of power. So Louis the 14th kind of brought them to heel a little bit, not for the benefit of the greater society, for the benefit of himself. But the nobility, comparatively speaking, had less power under the 14th, under Louis the 14th. But the 15th and 16th gave them great power. You have heavy industry that is controlled by the nobility, and it was also divided. You have nobility of the robe versus nobility of the sword. Okay, one bought their titles, one were born into their titles. All right, so second estate continued. So now let's break down that divided nobility a little bit more succinctly, right? So nobility of the robe, they derived their status from office holding. It was a pathway for commoners to attain noble status. So nobility of the robe, they effectively paid for their titles or were granted their titles through patronage. They dominated the law courts and the administrative offices. The nobility of the sword were the descendants of medieval nobility, so what we would consider the traditional aristocracy. In terms of wealth, there were some members of the nobility that were poor, but not too many. They married within their class and their wealth status so that they maintained the class and wealth structure that existed in the noble class, the second estate. They were also exempt from the major tax, the taille. So you can imagine who's paying this tax. All the poor people are paying this tax. The goal of nobility was they sought to expand power and privilege. Let me move my little camera guy here up a little bit. At the expense of the monarchy. So their goal was to really stick it to the monarchy and get as much power and privileges from them as they possibly could. All right, move my box down here a little bit. All right, so the goals of nobility and problems of monarchy really contributed to the development of the French Revolution significantly. They maintained control of military, the church, and the government. They had a very bad reaction to the Segur Law. In 1781, this limited the sale of military officerships to fourth-generation nobles, otherwise known as the bourgeoisie, thus eliminating many would-be nobles. So by preventing nobility people from becoming nobility of the robe, they made this division worse or exacerbated the division. They defended their own liberty, and they weakened the power of the monarchy in the process. Okay, so third estate. Third estate. All right. These are common people. They're the vast majority of the French population. They also had subdivisions within this class division. It varied by occupation, level of education, and of course wealth. The bourgeoisie was the middle class. They were about 8%, about 2.3 million people, and they owned 20 to 25% of all the land in France, so a significant amount. The peasants were 75 to 80% of the population. They owned 35 to 40% of all land in France. Their obligations to the nobility were extensive, and they were holdovers from the economic, social, and political system of feudalism, which you should know from your studies in the Middle Ages. They were skilled artisans, shopkeepers, and wage earners for the most part. So that's the class structure in terms of what France looked like. All right. So just to give you, I'm going to move my camera guy over a little bit. Okay, so land versus population. This is a good visual of why there were so many problems. So the clergy had much more land relative to their population, as did the nobility, as did the bourgeoisie. And then you get to the peasants who are like, what? You know, their land to population distribution was completely uneven relative to the other three sets of folks on this graph. Okay, and now this is going to be, I'm going to pull this up over here. Let me Okay, well, either way, I'm just going to move this around. So let's start out with membership. We have characteristic, the first estate, the second estate, bourgeoisie, and the third estate, right? So the membership, percentage of population, clergy numbered roughly about 1%, nobility was about 2%, middle class was about 8%, skilled artisans and peasants were about 80%. Okay, so that's what you see the very drastic population differences here. Okay, so this is the rough number of population that they had. Their wealth, church-owned, very wealthy, comparable to nobility, and almost nothing in terms of the third estate, had very little wealth. A percent of land ownership. So when you look at this, you can see not just visually, but now you can see numerically via this chart how little the third estate had relative to everyone else. Okay. And then if you go and further look at occupations, you can see what they did. And then the payment of the tally, exempt, and both of these were required to pay. So the bourgeoisie and the third estate kind of banded together. But then, as you will see, the bourgeoisie kind of bails on the third estate over the course of the revolution. Political power, lots. They were pretty good. Not so much, and basically none. So that's in terms of where the power lies. All right. Move my camera back down here. Okay, nobility versus bourgeoisie. They were very competitive with each other. The bourgeoisie tried to buy titles. During the 18th century, there were 6,500 new titles bestowed, and between those years right there, there were 2,500 new titles. So you're talking about a significant amount of titles. Kitties. Arbus. Sorry. Nobles tried to keep the class pure. They didn't want it being mixed with these people who bought their way into nobility. They liked the Seeger law. Their wealth was almost equal at this point. Political and social benefits were very different, however. The bourgeoisies wanted noble wealth, or they had noble wealth and peasant status, all right? So they wanted more from society. They shared the beliefs in Enlightenment political thought, and the French Revolution largely stems from the battle between these two groups. All right, so reading check. Let's see if you guys are paying attention. Is it a fair assessment to say that the differences between these two groups caused the French Revolution? Why or why not? All right, so I want you to pause the video and jot down your opinion about this and basically give me a thesis statement. All right, so I want you to be specific. So let's make sure that you're not only reading but paying attention to this PowerPoint. All right, so problems for the monarchy. They had an inability to deal with changing social issues and realities. See bourgeoisie versus nobility. So they were not actively managing this problem between those two. In the 1780s, you had bad harvests in 87 and 88. You had a manufacturing depression, rising food prices, food shortages, and a high number of poor people. So even though the economic outlook was good during this particular set of years, it was bad. And it was like a perfect storm of items that occurred that paved the way for the French Revolution to take place. You also had a lot of problems with privilege and political institutions. All right, so let me bring this guy back down here. Now, continuing with the problems for monarchy, you have a lack of reform via the French Parlement. All right, they stopped reform efforts, they blocked royal edicts, and they blocked all new taxes, which of course made it difficult to pay down any debt. Economic collapse was an immediate cause of the French Revolution, because although we said before economic things were going well, but then we hit a problem. We had a problem period. All right. Expenditures grew, but income did not. I want you to understand that economic collapse was the immediate cause of the French Revolution. Okay. We had expensive wars, royal excesses, and no new taxes to offset all this debt. So we have massive debt and interest on the debt. Okay, that's what people don't think about. You got to pay interest. When you take out a loan, you have debt, you got to pay interest on that loan. People weren't thinking about that. So interest accounted for just the interest. Forget about the actual principal amount, but just the interest accounted for half. One half, that is 50% of all government spending. That is not a way to run an effective economy. You're asking for trouble when you do things like that. It might be a word of note, word of caution to the United States. You might want to pay attention to things like this. See, we can learn things from history. Yep. Thesis builder. All right, now, what I want you guys to do is I want you to pause the video again and write me a thesis statement. You are going to be submitting this to me. So identify the grievances of the groups that made up the Third Estate in France on the eve of the French Revolution, and analyze the extent to which one of these groups was able to address its grievances in the period 1789 to 1799. This is from the 2007 FRE released free response AP exam. So I want you to pause the video and then create a thesis statement for me. All right, that is the end of part 2. I will see you guys in part 3.